What if everything you were taught about human progress was built on a quiet, comfortable lie? Right now, you are surrounded by walls, heating systems, packaged food, and the illusion that civilization has made you strong. But strip all of that away. No power grid, no supermarket, no signal on your phone, and the truth becomes brutal. Most modern humans would not survive a single week in the wild. Not because we are weak by nature, but because we chose to forget. Centuries ago, something extraordinary existed on this continent. Men and women who could read the wind like a map, carry fire through a rainstorm without a single match, and build a home that breathed like a living thing. They left no written records, but they left something far more powerful. And here, at Primal Echoes, we believe that knowledge does not die. It waits. Before this video ends, you will discover how a piece of dried meat could outlast a refrigerator by decades, and how a sliver of carved bone once protected human eyes better than modern sunglasses ever could. Stay with us. By the end, you won't just learn history. You'll remember who you really are. What if the most perfect food ever created was invented 1,000 years before refrigeration existed? Not in a laboratory, not by a scientist with measuring instruments and climate-controlled storage, but by a Lakota woman kneeling beside a fire in the middle of a blizzard, her hands moving with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned this from her mother, who learned it from hers, going back further than any written record could reach. That food was called pemmican, and what it represents is not just nutrition. It is one of the most sophisticated applications of food chemistry ever developed by the human mind. The process began with bison meat, sliced into thin strips and dried slowly under the sun or over low smoke until every trace of moisture had been pulled from the fibers. Moisture is where bacteria live. Remove it completely, and you remove the clock that makes food expire. The dried meat was then ground into a fine powder using stone pestles, a process that broke down the cellular structure and maximized surface area for what came next. Melted fat, taken from the richest, most caloric parts of the carcass, was poured over the meat powder in equal measure and mixed until the two became one inseparable substance. Sometimes dried berries were folded in, bird cherry, cranberry, adding vitamins and a sharpness that cut through the heaviness of the fat. The mixture was packed tightly into rawhide bags, every air bubble pressed out by hand, and sealed. In that form, pemmican could last 5 to 10 years without refrigeration, without vacuum sealing, without a single chemical preservative. A single 40-kilogram bag could feed a family for months. European fur traders, when they first tasted it, had no word for what it was. They called it the bread of the desert, and immediately began stockpiling it for their own long expeditions. Modern nutritionists who have analyzed its composition describe it as a near-perfect balance of protein, fat, and carbohydrate for conditions of extreme physical stress. The Lakota woman kneeling in the snow did not need a nutritionist to tell her that. She already knew. But food alone does not save you. You need shelter. And what they built next defied the laws of physics in ways that modern architects spent 40 years trying to fully understand. The teepee is one of the most misunderstood structures in human history. Popular culture reduced it to a simple tent made of sticks and animal skin, a primitive solution for primitive people. That image is not just wrong, it is the opposite of the truth. The teepee is an aerodynamic and thermodynamic system of extraordinary precision, and the proof of that is simple. It worked flawlessly in conditions that would destroy most modern camping tents within hours. The cone shape was not chosen for tradition or aesthetics. It was chosen because a cone is the most wind-resistant geometric form that can be built with poles and flexible covering. When hurricane-force winds strike a flat wall, they push. When they strike a cone, they slide, curving around the surface, pressing the structure downward rather than sideways, anchoring it to the ground with the force of the storm itself. But the shape was only the beginning. Inside the teepee, a secondary wall called the dew curtain was hung from the poles at roughly head height, descending to the ground and creating a narrow corridor between the outer covering and the inner living space. Cold air entered through small gaps at the base of the outer wall, traveled up through that corridor, warmed as it rose, and was drawn upward toward adjustable smoke vents at the peak. vents that could be rotated with long external poles to face into or away from the wind, controlling the draft with remarkable precision. This created a continuous convection current that pulled smoke from the central fire straight up and out, while simultaneously heating the air inside the living space and insulating it from the cold exterior. When temperatures outside dropped to 20 below zero, the air inside a well-built teepee remained warm enough to live without heavy clothing. Not warm by comparison, genuinely warm. And here is the detail that surprises even engineers who study it. The teepee was not a perfect symmetrical cone. The back wall was deliberately steeper than the front, shifting the center of the structure slightly backward. This asymmetry was not a mistake. It was a calculated response to the prevailing westerly winds of the Great Plains, reducing resistance on the windward side and creating additional interior space on the sheltered side. The entrance always faced east, toward the morning sun, away from the dominant wind direction. It could be assembled and disassembled in under an hour. It followed the bison herds across thousands of kilometers of open prairie, and it kept people alive through winters that would stop most modern survival experts in their tracks. But staying warm means nothing if you cannot light a fire, especially when the forest around you has been soaked by 3 straight days of rain, and everything that should burn is dripping. They didn't make fire, they carried it, alive, for days. This is the detail that most survival guides never mention, because it requires a completely different way of thinking about fire itself. Modern people see fire as something you create when you need it. The people of the Great Plains understood something deeper. Fire is not a tool you switch on and off. Fire is a companion. And like any companion worth keeping, it must be cared for continuously. The secret lived inside an unremarkable growth on birch tree trunks, the tinder fungus. Its inner layer, soft and suede-like to the touch, had a property that seemed almost magical. A single spark dropped onto it would not burst into flame. Instead, it would begin to smolder, slowly, steadily, like a coal with a heartbeat. That smoldering material was placed inside a hollowed bison horn, packed with layers of rotten wood and compressed tinder to cradle the heat, and sealed with just enough airflow through tiny holes to keep the ember breathing without ever letting it flare. A young warrior entrusted with the fire horn during a winter migration understood exactly what he was carrying. It was not just warmth, it was the life of everyone moving with him through the cold. Losing that fire did not mean inconvenience. It meant danger, wet forest, frozen ground, no way to dry clothing, no way to cook, no way to signal. In some tribes, the role of firekeeper was considered a sacred duty, passed only to those who had proven their reliability beyond question. That ember, glowing quietly inside its horn, could survive for days. And when camp was finally made, all it took was a breath, a handful of dry grass, and within minutes, the fire was alive again. Fire kept you alive through the cold. But drinking the wrong water could kill you in 48 hours. And on the open plains, and along the great rivers of North America, clean water was never guaranteed. The Missouri River looked like liquid mud. Travelers who drank directly from it risked illnesses that could put a warrior flat on his back for weeks, turning him from a hunter into a burden. The solution was not to find a cleaner river. The solution was to use the earth itself as a filter. Moving several meters back from the riverbank, they chose a spot where the soil was loose and sandy, and there they dug, deep enough that the bottom of the hole sat below the water level of the river itself. Then they waited. Under natural pressure, river water began seeping horizontally through the earth, toward the lower point of the pit, passing through meters of sand, clay, and fine gravel on its way. Each layer stripped away another fraction of the contamination: silt, algae, suspended solids, and a significant portion of harmful bacteria. What collected in the pit was clear and cold, even when the river 2 meters away ran brown. It was a multi-stage filtration system that required nothing but a digging tool and an understanding of how water moves through the ground. When rocky terrain made digging impossible, they used a different solution, one that a modern survival company would later sell for $40 and call revolutionary. A hollow bone or thick reed stalk was packed tightly with layers of coarse grass, clean sand, and crushed charcoal, and used as a drinking tube directly from the water source. The charcoal was the critical element. Long before activated charcoal appeared in water purification science, these people understood intuitively that burned wood draws harmful substances out of liquid and eliminates the smell of stagnant water. Independent testing of similar primitive filters has shown filtration rates comparable to early commercial survival straws. The life straw, that icon of modern outdoor survival gear, works on principles these people applied 8 centuries earlier. Clean water, warm shelter, food that lasts for months. But none of it matters if the weapon in your hand falls apart the moment it strikes bone. And on the Great Plains, your weapon was the difference between eating and starving. Archaeologists found arrowheads glued 800 years ago that remain impossible to remove today without damaging the shaft itself. That is not legend. That is a documented material reality, sitting in museum collections across North America, and it raises a question that stops materials scientists mid-sentence. What were they using? The base of the adhesive was collagen, extracted by boiling the hooves and connective tissue of bison, deer, or moose for hours until the material broke down into a thick, dark, gelatinous concentrate. This was dried into solid tiles that could be stored indefinitely and reactivated with water and heat when needed. Hot collagen glue penetrated the grain of wood and bone at a molecular level, creating a bond that tightened as it dried rather than simply sitting on the surface. But collagen alone was not enough. Pine resin, collected from living trees, was melted and modified with 2 additional ingredients: finely ground charcoal and dry herbivore dung. The charcoal acted as a structural filler, binding the resin matrix and dramatically increasing hardness after setting. The result was a black mastic that held stone arrowheads to wooden shafts through strikes against rock and bone, that was unaffected by moisture and temperature change, and that could only be released by reapplying heat. For composite bows, layered constructions of wood, horn, and sinew that represented the highest technology of plains warfare, an even more refined adhesive was used. Glue rendered from the swim bladders of sturgeon fish, which provided extraordinary adhesion combined with the elasticity needed to survive the violent flexion of a bow at full draw. That bow could serve its owner for an entire lifetime without the layers separating. They built weapons that outlasted the men who made them, using chemistry that the modern world is only beginning to fully appreciate. And yet, even with fire, clean water, food, and weapons that held together under pressure, there was one more enemy that could bring a hunter down without warning. Not cold, not starvation, light itself. They solved snow blindness 3,000 years before Oakley existed, using nothing more than a piece of carved bone. On the open plains in winter, the sun reflecting off an unbroken field of snow is not just uncomfortable, it is medically dangerous. Within hours, the ultraviolet radiation reflected from that white surface can burn the cornea with the same efficiency as staring directly into a welding arc. The condition it produces, snow blindness, fills the eyes with the sensation of ground glass, causes uncontrollable tearing, and renders a hunter completely helpless in an environment where helplessness is fatal. The solution they engineered required no glass, no UV filtering polymer, and no manufacturing facility. It required only a flat piece of bone, antler, or birch bark, and a narrow horizontal slit cut across the center. The physics behind it is the same principle that NASA engineers later applied in optical instruments, the pinhole effect. By reducing the aperture through which light enters, you reduce the total intensity of light reaching the eye, without eliminating the information the eye needs to see clearly. In fact, the narrow slit does something counterintuitive. It increases visual acuity, sharpening detail on the horizon, in the same way a camera's depth of field improves when the aperture is closed down. The interior surface of the goggles was always blackened with soot, not for decoration, but to absorb any light that entered from angles, eliminating internal glare that would otherwise bounce around inside the device and defeat its purpose. They did not fog. They did not freeze. They did not break. An old hunter, preparing his son for his first winter expedition across the open plains, would press a pair of these goggles into the young man's hands with a quiet deliberateness that needed no explanation. The carved surface carried the wear of years. It had protected eyes that had tracked bison through blizzards, read the sky through storms, and watched sunrises over more winters than the sun could yet imagine. That object was not equipment. It was memory, passed forward. And once the eyes were protected, the next challenge was one that has defeated trained military units in the modern era: finding your way home across a landscape with no visible landmarks whatsoever. 10,000 square kilometers of identical grassland. No mountain, no river in sight, no road, no trail, no GPS signal, no compass needle. And yet they never got lost. Not because they had a supernatural sense of direction, but because they had learned to read a language that the land itself was constantly speaking, and that most modern people have completely forgotten how to hear. The wind was the first and most reliable voice. Across the Great Plains, the prevailing winds follow seasonal patterns, with a consistency that functions as a navigational instrument. A warm flow from the south in summer, a sharp cold push from the north in winter. Feeling the direction of airflow on the cheek was enough to maintain course across an entire day of travel without a single fixed landmark. Beneath their feet, the tall grass told the same story. Years of exposure to constant wind had trained the stalks to lean in the direction of prevailing air currents, and even on a calm day, those frozen angles pointed like compass needles for anyone who knew to look. Anthills clustered on the south sides of rocks and shrubs, oriented toward maximum solar exposure. Moss grew thick on the north-facing surfaces of boulders, where moisture lingered longest in the shade. At night, the North Star became a fixed anchor around which the entire sky revolved, and the position of the Big Dipper told experienced navigators not only which direction was north, but approximately what hour it was, the sky functioning as both compass and clock simultaneously. Routes were not recorded on paper. They were encoded in stories. A path would be remembered as a narrative. Travel to where the white bison was taken, then bear toward the grove of dry willows, then follow the long ridge where the eagle nests. Geography became mythology. Landmarks became ancestors. The land remembers even when you forget, and by weaving the route into a living story, they ensured that the land's memory would always be accessible to anyone who had heard the tale. Stone cairns, stacked on hilltops, marked water sources and safe passages through ravines, some of them standing for generations. Each one a message written in the only alphabet that does not require literacy. This was not primitive navigation. This was a complete geographic information system, distributed, redundant, and encoded into the culture itself so deeply that it could not be lost as long as a single elder remained to tell the story. And the ability to move across vast distances with precision meant nothing without the ability to communicate across those same distances. Which brings us to perhaps the most underestimated technology of all. Their information network covered an entire continent, with zero technology as we understand the word. Dozens of tribes speaking languages as mutually incomprehensible as English and Mandarin could meet on the open plains, and within minutes be negotiating trade agreements, forming military alliances, or sharing detailed accounts of bison movements hundreds of kilometers away. The bridge between them was plain sign language, not a simplified gesture system, but a complete linguistic structure with grammar, syntax, and a vocabulary sophisticated enough to convey legal concepts, emotional nuance, and geographic precision. The sign for truth was a single finger drawn directly outward from the heart. That one gesture contains an entire philosophy. Beyond face-to-face communication, they built a long-range signaling network that functioned across distances of 30 to 40 kilometers on a clear day. Smoke signals interrupted by a blanket created a coded pulse system. Enemies approaching, herd located, all clear. Readable only by those who knew the specific tribal code, making it an encrypted broadcast that adversaries could see but not interpret. Mirrors of polished mica, or metal reflected sunlight in controlled flashes. A heliograph system that predated the military adoption of the same technology by centuries. At night, burning arrows arced through darkness, carrying messages between hilltops. And beneath all of it, ran a sound-based network of animal call codes. An owl calling 3 times at the wrong interval was not a bird. It was a warning. Their internet had no server. It required no infrastructure, no maintenance, no power source. It ran entirely on human intelligence, collective memory, and sunlight. And unlike our networks, it could not be hacked, shut down, or disrupted by a storm taking out a cell tower. What these people built, across every domain of survival, was not a collection of clever tricks. It was a complete and coherent system of living, one that modern civilization, for all its complexity, has not yet fully learned to replicate.